So one of the best parts about building quads is that you get to play with fire. I'm a little bit of a pyro. Hey everybody, I'm Bacon Ninja, and today we are going to take step 2 of building my budget build. In the last step, we built the Source One V5 frame, but in this step, we're going to be putting the ESC and the motors into this quad. Don't pay attention that it's missing a prop. I kind of crashed it last time I flew it. It's still here though, because this build is actually very rugged for the price. The goal of this build is to be less than $250. And if you don't know what this build is, I'll put a link in the description below for the first video in the series. This is an entire series related to this build, but this is step 2. And for step 2, you're going to need a few things. And I've got all of the things laid out here on my bench that we're going to be using. We, of course, need our built frame. We need the SpeedyBee stack. We need 4 Xing 2207 motors. And as far as tools go, we'll be using a flux soldering pin, very important to use flux, an assortment of tweezers, a 2mm driver, some side cutters for convenience, some wire strippers. The wire strippers are actually optional. If you're one of those people that strips wires with their thumbnails, then more power to you. But if you're new to it, I recommend wire strippers, because if you strip it back the wrong length, it's gonna be a bad day for you. So wire strippers if you've never done it before, fingernails if you are a pro. You'll also need some 4-inch type 21 cable ties, an assortment of heat shrink. I use a torch for my heat shrink, but that's up to you. Also an assortment of soldering iron tips. This is my wide tip on my butane iron because I like it there. And then I have my pointed tip on my Hako 907. I've actually had this iron since I was a kid, which is a long time ago now. It's something like 15 years that I've owned this iron, and I've never even put a new tip on it. I just take good care of my tips with the next tool I'm going to show you, which is a tip cleaning can that includes a brass brush, and down in the bottom under the brass brush is some rosin flux, so that it cleans the tip when you poke it in there, and some leaded solder. I like this. This is 6337 solder, very reasonably priced. As well as a set of holding hands, because you don't want to be grabbing hot things while you're using hot things to put them together, or else you will have sausages for fingers, and they're not as tasty as real sausage. So that's kind of disappointing. And then this last optional component, which are the skids that I printed for the build. And that is everything you need for step 2. But if you're like me and you have all your crap out on your desk, part A of step 2 is clean your workspace off, because you will be using a hot iron and you don't want clutter in your workspace when you're using a hot iron. I'm also going to be using a butane iron for some of the wider stuff, and this thing does eject hot gas. So I have to be very careful about my workspace. So clean up your workspace. But after that, just get out your Source One V5 frame and take the top plate off, take the camera plates out, and then we're going to be fitting the ESC in there. And here is my frame with the top plate removed. I also have my SpeedyBee stack. I'm just going to open this thing up, take the little card doodad out, and get my ESC. This is the ESC that we'll be putting in. That just slides with the stock gummies right on top of the 4 standoff screws. While I'm in the box, I'm also going to open it up, move the flight controller out of the way, get in the accessories bin, and take out a couple things. Namely, this large capacitor and this power lead here, because we're going to be using that in just a second. And I hope you're ready to work, because now that we have validated the ESC fits down on the stack screws, it's time to attach this XT60. And the way I have planned this XT60 to work out, you actually don't need to trim it at all. You can just go with the stock ends here. So I'm going to pull my ESC out. I'm going to set it up on my bench for soldering. And then I'm going to put this XT60 on. Maybe I can give you some tips on how to do it along the way. I keep wagging this thing around a lot. It's more fun than it looks like. It's kind of wrong. And here's the thing about soldering an XT60 onto an ESC. You kind of want to use something like holding hands to hold the ESC while you put the XT60 on here. But the problem that presents is that there are a bunch of surface mount components on this board. And the process of soldering such a large gauge wire to these pads is going to require quite a bit of heat. And a little bit of time. Now, you don't want to spend any more time with the heat on the pad than you have to, but what little time we have to is still going to transfer quite a bit of heat up to the FETs. And something like a holding hands, even with my little rubber grippies here, is probably going to be touching one of those surface mount components. And there's always a potential that one of them slides off or to a different position because of the heat we're applying. So the way I like to do this is just set the ESC bottom facing down on a non-flammable heat-resistant surface with my gummies in, because that'll give me some friction to work with, and just solder it on that way. So I have my tile here and my ESC, so what I'm going to do is just attach the lead like this. Now, to prep the lead for soldering, you will want to hold it in something. I use my holding hands, spread it out a little bit, because we're going to want to wet the ends here with some solder just to make sure they stick well to this, and then we're going to want to prep these pads with some solder as well, just to make sure the joint goes as well as it can in the conditions. And for this step, I'm going to be using my butane iron with the widest tip I have, because I want to apply the heat to as wide a surface as possible. I also have this thing cranked up about as high as it goes. If you have an electric iron, 450 as high as it goes, because we want to keep it on there as little time as possible. Now that my iron's preheated, let's clean the tip and then let's get all this stuff done. So to clean this tip, I'm just going to put a little bit of solder on it. It smokes nice and good. That means it's hot. And then I'm going to dip it in my cleaning brush. And you can see the rosin flux coming out there and cleaning my tip for me. So I'm just going to want to wet it and put it on the ends of these leads, because I want to make a little solder ball on the end there. There's a good chance that this solder that's on this lead is leaded solder or lead-free solder, and it's not going to stick very well to our pad if I don't put a little bit of leaded solder on there first. So I wet that. Now let's get the pads on the ESC wet. I don't want to spend too much time with my iron touching the ESC, because I will transfer heat, but with a wide tip like this and the iron turned up quite a bit, it really doesn't take too long to do. You don't want to have to rework it too much, because like I said, you want to keep the heat as far from the FETs as you can get, and the longer you have it on, the more heat there is. All right, that looks about prepped to do our work. And now what will be important is to keep your tip clean, because you have just used all of the flux that was inside of the solder to make that joint. We also probably want to dab it a little bit with our flux pin. It will boil off, but what is left on there will kind of help a little bit to make the cleanest joint possible. So I've got my helping hands arranged in a way that will hold the positive lead on the positive pad for me. I've got my tip clean, and I have put a little bit of this on the pad before I set it there. And what I'm going to want to do here is just take my iron, get it wet on the bottom a little bit, and then I'm just going to hold it down onto this red lead here until we get one nice consistent puddle. And then I'm going to let it dry. And there we go. We now have the red, the hot on. We're going to do the same thing with the ground side. I'm just going to kind of put it right over the spacing for the pad. Before I do that, I'm actually going to go ahead and dab it again with this. And be very careful with the tip of your iron, because this thing is still blazing hot and you don't want burning sausage fingers. Nobody likes smelly burnt sausage fingers. Give my iron a little bit of a dabbing clean again. I'm going to wet the bottom of the tip again. And then I'm just going to put it on the black pad. There we go. Now we have both of them correctly connected to the ESC. And if you've done all that correctly, your XT60 is now attached to the ESC. Remember to look for the plus for the red wire, the positive side, negative for the negative wire, the negative side, and your pads look pretty decent. These aren't too bad. It's probably not my finest work, but it's not too bad. On the bottom side, I do have a drip hanging down from the bottom. That's okay, because we're actually going to use that to relocate the capacitor here in a minute. And I forgot to tell you to bring wire to the table. My bad. You're going to need a little bit of wire to do this, and nothing in the kit comes with it. So I will go get my wire in a second and show you what I forgot, because bacon's sometimes forgetful. It's all the grease. But anyway, what we're going to do first is we are going to set this in the quad and just make sure everything lines up and that we're not touching anything funny. It is always important to take the time between steps to do that, just to make sure that you aren't getting into some situation you haven't foreseen where something about this is touching the frame or a screw or your little solder ball down here dripped too far and it's touching the frame. You don't want those kinds of things. And now is the time to check for them before you have crammed a bunch of components in it. So I'm going to get my frame out again. I'm going to cover my iron and make sure it is safe from all of the heat we just put out of it. And yeah, we're going to check this in the frame. So here's my frame again, and making sure that I have the top of the ESC facing up, which is not the side with the plug, I am just going to set this back down in the frame. And the goal is that these wires go between the standoffs there. We will eventually have these wires coming out in this way and up, but for now they can just go between the standoff. We're going to put a VTX back here, so we don't want these bobbling around on the VTX. And we're just going to look from the side and make sure that nothing is making any contact in there. I think everything looks pretty good. There's plenty of room. Even if I squish the gummies down, nothing is going to get smashed onto the frame or any of the screws down there. And now it is time to prepare to relocate this massive capacitor. Most of the time when you get a quad, the capacitor just hangs right off where the lead is, but this thing is ginormous and it's a good cap, so we're definitely going to use it. The alternative to that is to put it on the battery side of the XT60, which I absolutely hate because you will smash the ever-living crap out of it and your cap is going to come off and you may or may not know, and then you're going to be messing stuff up for no good reason. Just put the cap in a good spot. Now, this is a very narrow frame, so I don't have a lot of room to hang this out the back if I want to make the power lead come out the side. We're actually going to move this to the front, and I'll show you how to do that. But this is the wire that I forgot to show you. This is 24 gauge silicone coated wire. It comes in a box like this, and we're just going to use some red and some black. We're going to cut about, I don't know, 6 or 7 inches of it off, something about yay long. We're actually going to wind up making that a lot shorter in the end, but just for safety, we're going to give ourselves plenty to work with. So go ahead and get some 24 gauge silicone wire out, and yeah, cut about 8 inches of it off, and let's prep to relocate this capacitor. And here are my pieces of wire. Now you have a couple of options when it comes to stripping the ends of these wires. We only need a little bitty bit that's going to go on the bottom of the pad. But what I like to do is use my thumb and my thumbnail and just pull about a ½ inch off. And then I spin the wire in my hand so that none of the strands are loose hanging out there. Do the same thing with the other one, about a ½ inch. It really doesn't matter at this point because we can trim this up. Where it's going to make a big difference is on the other end, closest to the capacitor, and we'll probably wind up using some of these to do it on that side, because it has to be a little more precise on that end. But for now, as long as you have something that looks like that, you should be fine. Let's get my helping hands out. We're going to put a little bit of solder on this, then I'm going to trim it with my side cutters, and then we're going to put it on the bottom side of the ESC. And for this step, I'm swapping over to my Hako with a little bit smaller of a tip because you don't need a huge wide tip to do this. I have this iron set to about 425 degrees Celsius. Yours probably has Celsius measurements, so that's the easiest way to do this. I'm going to clean my tip, and then we're going to prep these wires for use. So again, just dip my tip in the brush. I want to see a little bit of smoke knowing it's getting cleaned. It's nice and shiny, so I'm just going to take it over here, set my tip under the wire, and run a little solder up from the bottom to the top. It's okay if you have a little ball of solder on the top. That is not a big deal at all. Now, why did I start at the bottom? Because if you start at the top, what will happen is the solder will wick down the wire and go into where it is cased with the silicone. And then you're going to get a weird stiff wire that you can't bend. But if you start at the bottom and you work up, that doesn't happen. Lots of years of experience doing this stuff. All right, let's get these wires trimmed to size. Let's throw them on the bottom of the ESC, and then let's do the hard work of actually relocating the capacitor. And now that they're wetted, I'm just going to cut them down to about an 1/8 inch. Nothing too crazy, just enough to work with in my solder ball on the bottom of the ESC. There's what that looks like. Now be sure that you don't have stuff like this laying around on your workbench, because that will get in a quad and it will cause a fire. A lot of people have little solder balls running around their builds or little scraps of wire like this that get in a place and they never notice, and that's how you have problems. So always pick these up and put them in a spot that is not going to wind up back on your bench somewhere. Not the floor, because if you step on them, that'll be really painful as well. I just have a little box I throw them in off to the side. So that's where they're going. But now that we have our wires sized, let me pop the ESC out of the frame again. I'm going to put it on a heat-proof surface, and then we're going to throw these on the bottom in those little balls that kind of drip down from our original solder job. And here's the underside of our ESC. What we're going to do is we're going to take the ground wire here and the hot wire here, and we're just going to solder to these little solder drips that are left over from our original solder job, or you can get it in the pad if you want to. It's really up to you either way. I'm probably going to get a little in the pad and a little bit in that solder ball. Just, I want a good connection. But these are going to run under our ESC and up to the front where our capacitor will be. And it is important that you use a high gauge. 24 is about the smallest I'd go. You can go 22 if you want to use a little bit bigger. There is some room. But the bigger gauge you use and can get away with in your build, the better the capacitor is going to work having been relocated. Now, when we finally get it in there, we're actually only going to be using about that much wire. So it's not like this whole thing is going to be between us and the cap. It's not too big a deal, but let's get these thrown on here. As always, start by cleaning your soldering iron and then get your solder. And I'm going to put a little bit on the pad here. I'm going to clean it again. I waited a little too long. You don't want to wait very long between cleaning it and working. So there's a little bit on the pad there. It doesn't look super pretty, but that's okay. And then we're just going to take our wire and we're going to set it in and put some decent pressure on there till it starts to melt. We want that to kind of work its way into the solder ball, and we don't want to be able to pull it. It is a little grayer than I'd like, but that'll be okay. Clean between doing the other pad. I'm a little OCD with the cleaning. I like a really clean soldering iron. And avoid hitting that TBS diode right there in the middle while you're doing this side if you're going to do it across like I am. Just add a little fresh solder on the bottom here. And then we're going to throw the ground wire on. There we go. So we have our hot and our ground for relocating the capacitor on the bottom of this build. All right, so we have a little bit of physical work to do. I'm going to go ahead and turn my iron off. It's important to not leave it on any longer than you have to because the thing's hot. And I keep talking about sausage fingers, but that is real. If you don't want to smell like fried chicken, don't leave the iron on your table. Mine's off. I'm getting my frame back out. You can see how this is going to work. That's the bottom of the board. So I'm just going to lay that there and hold these wires a little bit as I put them in. So you can kind of see how that's going to function. These wires are going to come out the front right there. And that is where our capacitor is going to set. It's going to set right about there. Let me get this thing out of the bag real quick. Be careful not to damage the legs of the capacitor when you're getting it out of the bag because they are pretty...
A few moments later.
Be careful not to damage the legs of your capacitor while you're getting it out of the bag. Don't like poke this in through the bag and then rip it like a gorilla. Don't do that. If you need to go get something to cut the bag with, do that instead. Because these are very fragile. If they break off right at the base, this capacitor is ruined. Now, if you don't know anything about capacitors, it essentially filters the current in our builds. It keeps big spikes from happening. It's kind of like a pool that extra current goes into, extra voltage goes into, and comes out of when it's necessary. Very important piece of our quads. And on one side, there is a stripe. On the SpeedyBee, it will be a gold stripe with a negative indicator. It looks just like that. That means that this side will be the side that gets the black wire because it is the ground side, and the opposite side with no mark is going to get the red wire because it is the hot side. Now, we can't just set the capacitor in like this because the legs stick up, right? We can't have them sticking up. They actually need to come out at an angle. And we want to think about how this is going to work because we know the black wire is coming out on the left side of the frame and the right wire is coming out on the right side of the frame. So we're going to need this stripe that has the negative side to go to the left. We're going to place the top of the can of the cap toward the ESC, so our legs are going to be sticking out toward the front of the quad, and we're going to want to bend these things. They need to go up. With the ground side facing your left, the legs need to go upward. And to do that, I'm just going to use this pair of tweezers. I'm going to get in here and I'm going to grab it about that far from the end. And then I'm just going to put a little pressure on it and bend them upward. No big deal. I'm going to go to the other side. And since I'm facing the opposite direction now, I'm going to bend it toward you. And then once I get it somewhat bent, I'm just going to finish the job with my hands. And what we should wind up with is a capacitor that has the legs sticking straight up in the air, facing up when you're holding the ground side to the left. And that will mean that our capacitor can sit in the frame just like this. That's essentially where it's going to live from now on instead of hanging off the backside where the lead goes in. Now we have to get these wires connected, and you'll notice everything's just a little bit too long here. So what we're going to want to do is trim these legs just a little bit. Now we have them bent about 1/4 or 1/8 inch from the top of the cap. And then what we're going to do is right where the leg sort of comes to the edge of the can, I'm going to use my side cutters and I'm going to cut the leg off there. I don't need it any taller than that. I just need it to come up about 1/8 inch and then come over about 1/8 inch, just like that. And since we have shorter legs now, we don't need these giant wires hanging out. So it's time to trim them to size. This is probably the most difficult part of this part of the process, is getting these wires trimmed to size and attached to the capacitor. Now, if you don't feel like you can do work this tight, that is perfectly fine. Feel free to leave a little bit of extra wire, leave yourself room to work. Don't ever give yourself an opportunity to not have enough room to work and feel crammed and then have to do bad work because of it. It's always better to give yourself a little more room. It doesn't have to be as neat and tight. If you're not a professional soldering iron user, it's perfectly fine. So I'm going to do this the way I'm going to do it, but just take it into consideration that yours might be longer depending on your comfort level. Hopefully not shorter though, because there's really not going to be a need to go shorter. So I'm going to start by setting the capacitor in place and kind of get a feel for where I want it to be. What's going to happen is we're going to solder to it here, and then we're going to run a zip tie around it to hold it in place. So this ought to give us plenty of room if it's about there. Now I have these wires, and I know that if I take them and turn them down a little bit here in the build, I kind of get a sense for how long they need to be. And that length is about this much. So if you can see about the distance there above the standoff, that's about where I'm going to cut mine. So about 1/2 inch in front of the second standoff in the front side of the build. And it's going to be a good idea to hold these at the same tension while you cut, and then just cut in one stroke. That way they are the same length. And there we go. I just removed this much wire from it, and that is what I will be working with. Now you have another decision to make. You're going to have to strip these. And we're only going to strip back a very small amount. About 1/8 of an inch. Maybe even less than that is what's actually going to be used. So if you don't feel like you can do that with your thumb, now is the time to get out your wire strippers and try to fit them in this cram little spot. You can just take the ESC off. You don't have to do this with it in the frame. It's perfectly fine if you take the ESC off and just strip the wire ends this way. It's up to you. It's all about how much time you're saving and how comfortable you feel. I'm going to do it this way because I think that makes the most sense. So with our ESC facing upside down, I'm just going to take each of these wires and I'm going to put it in my strippers, and I'm going to strip back about 1/8 of an inch. It's not very much at all. Just a very little bit. You'll notice the little end from the last stripping I did is still on the strippers. I'm actually going to use that to get the right amount on the second one so that they come out just about even. And there we go. We have 2 stripped ends for these wires, and they just look like that. That's about how far I stripped them back. Now I'm going to twist them, and then I'm going to wet them, and then we're going to use them to put this capacitor in the front. So I have these ends all wet, and now it's time to actually prep the ends on the capacitor itself. So I clean my iron, and I'm just going to take a little bit of solder, and I'm going to try to make a little solder ball on the leg, which just entails dabbing it very, very lightly. I want to gather a little bit of solder right there because that is what I want the wire to go to. If you just have the leg with no solder on it at all, it's going to be really hard to get a piece of wire to stick to it. So I just use a little dab of solder to do it. Now, one more step before we actually attach this is we're going to put a little bit of heat shrink on these 2 wires here to prep them so that we can heat shrink and cover the legs of this capacitor. You don't want the legs of your capacitor just blowing out in the wind, because all it's going to take is one piece of wet grass to cross those things, and hopefully the grass would just burn, but it might not. It might start off a chain reaction of horrific catastrophe. So I'm going to cut a little piece of heat shrink to protect us from that, and I'm going to go ahead and put it on the wires now, because once I start working on this, it's going to be impossible to do. So just a nice little 1/4 inch to 3/16 inch piece of heat shrink. And I know you can't really see it, but I have a little bit of clear shrink here, and I'm going to cut that to about this length. Now, what is that? I don't know. Probably 3/16 of an inch. I'm just going to make 2 of these that are completely identical, and I'm going to put one on each wire we have running under the ESC. So I'm just going to slide it right on top of the red wire and leave it there. And then I'm just going to slide the other one right on top of the black wire and leave it there. Because once we have everything soldered up to the capacitor, then we're going to use that heat shrink. But for now, it just needs to be in place. Now, if you're doing this inside your build, you can still do all of this the same way. The heat shrink will just make sure it doesn't go under the ESC and becomes impossible to find. So that does get a little more difficult. But for what we're doing, that's going to work for us. And now comes the most difficult bit of the whole process. I've got my helping hands holding the black and red wire with the ESC facing up. And now I'm going to put the capacitor on top of it. And to start that, I'm going to try to make another little solder ball on top of these wires. I'm going to give myself a little bit of spare solder to work with. And then I'm just going to grab my capacitor. I'm going to hold it underneath the black wire. And I'm just going to touch them together with a little bit of heat. And now we're attached. And then I'm going to go do the same thing with the red wire. And now we're attached over there too. And now we have a capacitor ready to be sealed up with a little heat shrink so that it doesn't get, shorted out or anything crazy like that. So I'm just going to pull my heat shrink, which fell down underneath the ESC like I talked about, all the way to the front. And you're going to notice it doesn't really bend. And if you have sharp little points like that, like I might actually go back and redo that one because I don't want it to poke through the heat shrink. But you just push the heat shrink as far onto the capacitor as you can get it. And to shrink my heat shrink, I'm actually going to be using my butane iron again because this has a nice little hot air vent coming out the side there, but you can use something with flame. It may leave a little bit of a scorch mark. Just be real careful if you use something like this or a lighter. But if you have a hot air option, use your hot air option. I'm just going to point the hot air at the shrink. Let that all get shrunk up real nice and goodly. Try it from a couple different angles just to make sure I get it all. And we're really looking for it to attach itself to the silicone of the wire. There we go. Just about shrunk on. And we have heat shrink on our capacitor. Our capacitor is officially relocated. So now, what do we do with this freshly relocated capacitor and dangling off the ESC situation? We're going to put this back in the frame. And I'm going to show you how to attach it so that it doesn't find its way out again. And the first step in this is going to be to make sure that we have on the bottom of the ESC the wires running in parallel under there and put a little bit of tension on them. Now, as we go down on the stack screws, I'm going to twist the cap into place. And that is essentially what it's going to look like. Now I'm going to split the wires on either side of the cap to expose the top of the can. Now I'm going to do that with just a couple of zip ties. I'm going to put one in the other one and then go all the way around the frame to hold the thing in. But before you do that, be sure to put your ESC harness in the connector first. Now that we've got everything fit, you can just kind of lift the board up and then put your ESC harness right in there, pop it in the hole. And before you zip tie this thing, because it's going to be hard to get to the ESC harness after you do, put it in there and then just move it out of the way. Do not get the ESC harness in the zip tied assembly. But once you get it to that point, you want to zip tie it down pretty tightly, and you want to make sure you don't pinch the black or red wire with your zip tie by getting it tight. Just try to get it in the air pockets, but make sure you put your ESC harness in there prior to doing that, or you're going to have a real bad day cutting it off and doing it again. And once you have all that done, you should have something like this. The zip-tied capacitor with the wires running on either side of the cap. You have your ESC harness in place, and your ESC can still move nice and freely on top of here. And now all we have left to do in this step is to put 4 motors on. Or if you want to count it in the number of cables, what is that? 12 more solder joints. But these are not simple solder joints, and there are some considerations that I need to show you real quick. And these are the motors we're going to be using. The Xing E Pro 2207 motors. They come with a little bag of screws and a prop nut. We're just going to set that aside for now. But what I'm going to start by doing is straightening out each one of these wires. Just run it through my fingers, get it nice and straight, because here in a second, we're going to put it on the drone and start prepping it for length sizing on the wires so we can solder this sucker on. And we're going to do them one at a time for the sizing. You get into a real mess if you start sizing all of your motor wires and then you try to solder them all at the same time. So we're going to size each one individually, and then we're going to pull each one off individually and solder each one individually so that we don't have any problems with the wire length or the cuts that we're making. Because if you make these too short, you will have a very bad day, and you're going to have to come back and either lengthen the wire or add a race wire board. And we're not going to do that because this is a budget build and we don't want to spend any more than we've already spent on this quad. So let me show you how I'm going to get the motor sizing done. And the first step will be opening this package to get just 2 of the screws out. We're going to use 2 screws to hold this motor in while we're doing all the sizing. Now be sure not to lose your other screws or your prop nut. Just throw them back in the package here and set those aside for later down the road when we get closer to done with this thing. Now we will be taking these screws in and out to do the motor work, so don't feel like this is the end all be all. You don't need to crank these things down, and the sizing might change if you decide to add arm protectors to yours, because these aren't quite long enough if you're going to use arm protectors. But for now, I'm just going to pop 2 of these things in one arm with the motor on there so we can get it nice and tight for sizing. And so now I've got my motor tightened on with just 2 screws on the arm to hold it in place, and I have my motor wires dangling. The end goal is that these motor wires are going to find their way over to these pads on the ESC, the last 3 on this side. That's where we're going to solder them to. But in order to get the sizing, I'm going to bust out my handy dandy chip clip here, and I'm just going to take the wires and hold them with a little bit of tension, and then put my chip clip on the arm to temporarily hold the wires while I'm doing the sizing. So you can see my chip clip is holding the wires in place while I do the sizing for the motor wires here. And what I'm going to do is one at a time, starting with the one closest to the rear. I'm just going to hold it in place on top of the ESC here, bend it over the pad, and then I'm going to cut the wire right at the back of the pad, right here, so that I know I have enough room. Now be careful not to nick any components on the ESC when you're doing this, and be careful to get the right wire, because there is an order to these things. So you want to make sure you have a little bit of tuck down the side for extra room. You bend the wire over the pad, and then you cut at the back side of the pad. I'm kind of using my thumb as a guide there. And now I'm on the one closest to me, which would be this 3rd pad here. So same thing, I give myself a little bit of room under the ESC, and I use my thumb as a guide to grab it and then cut at the back of the pad. And that is how I have sized my motor wires. There we go. They are the correct length. And what you want to do is go around the quad with all 4 motors and do the exact same thing. Now it's pretty obvious where the motor wires are going to go. The ones here for this arm go to the first 3. The ones here for this arm go to those first 3. And the ones in the back arm go to the last 3. And you just do them in order of the wire. Try not to cut them out of order. You can put them on in any order, but it's going to affect our ability to change the direction of the motor once we're done. So try not to do that if you don't have to. But if this is your first time, leave yourself a little bit of extra room. It's okay if your motor wires hang down a little bit and it's not as pretty as it could be. What is more important is that you have room to work, it makes a good connection, and the motor spins when you're done. So I'm going to take this motor off. I know I just have one on, but I'm going to take the motor off. We're going to go ahead and trim the ends, and I'm going to show you the process of soldering it on. And then you'll just want to repeat this whole process on all 4 arms. So now I have my motor off the arm, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take about 1/8 of an inch off the end of each of these wires. Just a little bit. It looks about like that. I'm going to strip them all to about that length. And like I said before, you can kind of do this thing where you use the size of the piece of silicone you just stripped off from the previous one to size the next one. That's perfectly acceptable. It tends to stick on there. So that's what I'm doing. I'm just lining up the size of the piece that came off with the new one, and I have 3 evenly stripped motor wires. So I'm just going to spin these in my fingers, give them a nice twist to make sure we don't have any stray little pieces of wire hanging out. And then I'm going to wet the ends of these with my iron, get them ready to solder onto the ESC. And I have my helping hands holding these, and I'm using a medium-sized chisel tip to do this on pretty high heat with my butane iron. Like I said, probably about 450 degrees Celsius if you're doing it with a regular desktop iron or something like a Pine Sil or a TS100, but I just went ahead and wet the tip of all 3 motor wires. And now it's time to put the motor back on the arm for soldering to the ESC. But here's the consideration. If you are not using any arm guards or skids, bumper things, then the stock screws that come with these Xing motors are perfectly fine. They will go through the carbon and they will not make their way up into your coil. But if you are using something like this skid protector, this arm cover, you're probably going to want to go with something a couple of millimeters longer. Now, the problem there is that over time, as you fly, the TPU will crush and the screws will get closer to the coils. So you just need to keep an eye on it, and you're going to have to regularly tighten them over the first, 20 flights to make sure they get seated all the way as the TPU crushes as much as it can crush. It's perfectly normal, and you may find that over some time, you actually need to change out the screws for shorter screws because your original ones become too long. They start poking through the motor base and up into the coil area. But what I'm going to do for now is I'm just going to put mine back on with 2 of the original screws, and I'm going to go back around after we're done and put these arm guards on. I'll show you how I do the sizing for that in case you're interested. But for now, just 2 of the normal screws to get things going. And I've also got my flux pin because I'm going to go ahead and dab the last 3 pads on this ESC with the flux pin and get them nice and clean because we are going to go ahead and prep that pad for soldering with our iron. Clean the tip again. I'm going to spin this thing a little sideways because I like to work that way. And then I'm just going to get a nice bead of solder on these pads for working with. I want it to be good and round. A little bit shiny is good. It doesn't have to be a gigantic bubble of solder. Just enough to work with. All right, now I'm going to take my motor wires and I'm going to start with what will be the shortest one. So that will be this one here. I'm just going to take it and I'm going to hold it with my hand, actually. You can do this with tweezers. That's what I was going to show you, but this one's easier by hand. And I'm just going to hold some force on it and press it into that solder ball. There we go. Now that's not super pretty. Let's say yours turns out like that. Doesn't come out super great. What you would do is just let that cool for a second. And then you're going to want to take your flux pin, dab it a little bit, and just touch your iron onto it and let it reball a little bit. That just means you ran out of flux in the joint. No big deal. Let's move on to the next one. And making sure to grab the proper middle wire, I am going to just do the same thing and put that on the solder ball there. And then the third one, same thing. Get some heat on it, let it fall into the solder ball. And we've got 3 wires on our ESC for that motor. And it's done. Now I'm going to go retouch that one joint that I just don't think looks pretty enough. But at this point, you would go all the way around the quad, trim your motor wires to length, and solder them on just like this. And then the last step will be to put the arm protectors on if you're going to, or put more screws in all the leftover holes since we've only been using 2 if you're not going to go with arm protectors. I would, however, recommend that you go with some kind of arm protector or even just like a little hard plastic skid if you have them laying around. It's always best to land on something like that other than the screws in your carbon arms because they are not going to hold up over time if you're just skidding the crap out of them. So I'm going to go put 3 more motors on this and then I'm going to show you that last step.
6 hours later.
And what looked instantaneous for you was about 15 minutes for me, but I have all 4 motors on now. So what's the next step? The next step is either one of 2 things. It is either to continue putting the screws in that came with the iFlight motors if you were going to run something like a foam pad underneath or maybe some hard skids, something like the Rotor-Riot skids. But if you're printing your parts at home and you have the protectors that I recommended, you're actually going to need a little bit longer screw. And I recommend a kit like this for just this instance, but the right size of screw for the feet designs that I recommended from Thingiverse is an M3x10. The standard iFlight screws are M3x8, so 2 millimeters longer is going to make the difference. Now, like I said, you're going to want to tighten these over the first 20 packs or so, and you're going to want to keep an eye on if they are moving up into the coil area of the motor. If they are, take them out and put your M3x8s back in if you can get them in, or an M3x9, which is a weird size. These 10s do hang over just a little bit, but it's not anything to be concerned about. They are just right for the job. Don't worry, but the 8s will not work if you were using the TPU feet. So now I'm going to go around the entire quad and take out the 2 temp M8x3s that I have in, or M3x8s that I have in, and put in my final M3x10s. Get all of my arm protectors on. And there we go. I have all 4 of my skids on and the proper size screws. Now we have to do something about these wires that are just kind of everywhere. They need to be attached to the arms somehow. And that somehow is a zip tie. I'm just going to use one zip tie on the end here, and then I'm going to show you my preferred way of wrapping the wires. You choose you. If you like it, do it. If you have another preference, do that as well. That's perfectly fine. But I'm going to show you how to pin the arms with the wires on top using a zip tie really quickly, because it is the easiest way to get them under control for however you want to loom the wires on top of the arms. And it's honestly really simple. What we're going to want to do is note where the lock part of the zip tie is, and I'm going to put it in my hand facing the front of the quad while I zip tie around from underneath. The reason I'm doing that is so that I can rotate this thing and have the zip end come out facing, you either want it facing here or facing here, so that when I cut it, it's not in the way. And what I'm going to do is just get it kinda on there. I'm not going to make it super tight. And then I'm going to arrange my wires. So I'm going to sort them to be left to right appropriately, and then I'm just going to kind of bend them down from the ESC, move them over to the arm, and hold them in place as I push this zip tie down toward the ESC. So I want to get it as close to the ESC as I can to make those wires sit nice and snug, and then I'm just going to zip tie my zip tie down. I'm going to pull it tight, and that will get our wires to sit appropriately on the arm. And then I'm going to go over it with some tape because I don't like it just having open wires like that. But I'm going to do that for all 4 arms to get the wires laid out. And then I'm just going to take a nice pair of small scissors and snip the end of that off. And once you have all that done, you should wind up with your motor wires nice and laying on the arm. Now, it's okay if there's a little bit of slack in there. I'm going to run some loom tape and electrical tape on top of this to kind of pin that down. And I think you should too, because if you leave them open like this, you're just asking for a branch to get under there and rip them off, or for a prop strike to kill it. It's gonna happen. So yes, I will be using red electrical tape. No, I did not steal the idea from JB. I have loved red electrical tape my entire life, and it just so happens to be my favorite color. So let me get a couple pieces cut and I'll show you how I do that. And we're going to start off with this loom tape. It's known as loom tape because it's kind of a fabric and it's made for looming wire harnesses in cars. And I have cut 4 pieces to this length, which is just about 4 inches. And what I'm going to do is take one of these arms and I'm just going to start my loom tape at the ESC side and at a little bit of an angle, right about where I have the zip tie. And I'm going to wrap it down under the arm. And then what I'm going to do is hold some pressure on it while I spin the loom tape around the arm. And I'm going to keep spinning it with that angle on the tape all the way up the arm so that it stays nice and consistently tight. And there we go. We have loom tape on our arm. The problem with loom tape on your arm, though, is that the edges don't really stick. That's where the electrical tape comes in. Let me throw loom tape on the rest of them, and then I'll show you how to seal the very ends with a little bit of electrical tape so they don't fray on you when you do put it in trees, because you will put it in trees or concrete or hopefully not a pond. But yeah, could happen, I guess. And there we go, loom tape on all 4 arms. It actually looks pretty good this way, doesn't it? Now we're just going to seal the ends with a little bit of this red electrical tape. And when it comes to your electrical tape, do not cheap out. Get Scotch 3M electrical tape. You want the good stuff. You buy the really cheap stuff on Amazon or in the store that's like $1 a roll, you will regret it because that stuff does not stick. It is not rubbery. You really want the good stuff and it's not that much more expensive. So stick with Scotch or 3M. I prefer red, but you can do this with any color you want. If you want pink or black or whatever you happen to find at your local store or on the internet, there should be a myriad of colors, but just make sure it's a good brand. And what I'm going to do is cut about 2-inch strips of this. I'm going to cut 8 of them. We will wind up using 8 2-inch strips, and I'll show you where they go. Now I have my strips of electrical tape. What I'm going to do is start by sticking it to the bottom on the end nearest the zip tie of this arm, and I'm going to make sure the piece of tape points toward the rear of the quad, because as I fold this over, what's going to happen, I'm going to keep a little bit of pressure on it, is I'm going to come out with a spot here that hopefully won't get snatched whenever I hit a tree or something. If you can make it all the way around again and come up under the arm facing that way, that is the best way to go. But if you can't, that's okay. And now I'm going to do the same thing for this end of the same arm. Just stick it to the bottom here underneath and wrap it around. Try to keep it in a straight line. It looks the best if you have straight lines going on this part of your quad. And there we go. That is how you seal the ends of the loom tape to keep them from fraying over time. So I'm just going to go do that to the other three, like everything else we've done in the second half of this video. And that's it. It is finally done. Step 2 of the budget build is complete. You have your ESC in place. You have your harness ready for the flight controller. You have relocated the capacitor. You have put your main lead on. You have put all 4 motors on, all 4 quad skids, and wrapped up all your motor wires. And whew, I know it was a long one. There was a lot in this step of the process. There's also going to be a lot in the flight controller step, and we're going to put the video system in at the same time, as well as the receiver. So that's going to be video number 3 in the series of building this thing. But don't forget, whenever I'm done with this, this is going to go home with somebody out there on my channel. I have almost hit 2,000 subscribers, and when I do hit 2,000, I will open up a giveaway to give away this exact build that I'm building here on the bench. You're watching me build it, and it could be hanging on your wall someday if you enter the giveaway. I appreciate all of you so much for building this with me. I hope you enjoy the build as much as I have. I have flown this thing a whole lot. Yes, it's analog. Yes, it's cheap, but I really enjoy ripping it. It is a lot of fun. Plus, a lot less guilt when I crash it, because it is just so cheap. Anyway, because this video is so long, I'm not going to ramble on anymore. If this has been helpful, give it a thumbs up. Subscribe if you haven't to keep up with the budget build and to see the next step in the series. After step 3, we will also be doing a step to configure all the Betaflight settings and set up your receiver, those kinds of things, and then it'll be ready to fly. So we're not too far off. So hang in there. I hope you enjoy it. And until next time, stay greasy. I'll catch you later. I love a good joint, a good solder joint. Probably shouldn't have said I love a good joint. And I guess that's like half the FPV community anyway.